there are mysteries, and then there are impossibilities. Events so bizarre, so utterly inexplicable, that they break the brain's ability to rationalize them. Events where every explanation, no matter how carefully constructed, leaves questions that can't be answered. Events that shouldn't exist in a rational universe. February 1959, the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. 9 experienced hikers are found dead, not just dead, scattered across a mountainside in various states of undress, in -25-degree weather, their tent torn open from the inside, their bodies showing injuries that make no sense. This isn't a story where someone got lost and froze. This isn't a tragic accident where people underestimated the conditions. This is something else, something that has defied explanation for over 60 years. Something that has generated theories ranging from avalanches to military weapons to things that shouldn't exist at all. The indigenous Mansi people call it Kholat Shachel, Dead Mountain. They say spirits walk there. They say no one should go there. The Russians who found the bodies call it Dyatlov Pass, named after the expedition's leader. But what they should call it is what it really is, the site of one of the most disturbing, inexplicable mysteries in human history. 9 people went into those mountains. Experienced hikers, engineering students, smart, capable, well-prepared. They were attempting a difficult route, yes, but one well within their abilities. They'd done harder treks before. This should have been challenging but manageable, an adventure, an achievement to be proud of. Instead, something happened on the night of February the 1st, 1959, that caused them to cut their way out of their tent and flee barefoot into a blizzard. Something so terrifying that they abandoned everything, coats, boots, supplies, everything they needed to survive, and ran down a mountainside in their underwear. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. What could possibly make you abandon shelter in sub-zero temperatures? What threat could be so immediate, so overwhelming, that hypothermia and frostbite seemed like the better option? They didn't just leave calmly, they cut through the tent, from the inside, with knives, tearing through the fabric in a desperate rush to escape. And then they ran, some in socks, some barefoot, running through snow, in darkness, in cold that could kill you in minutes. The search team found them weeks later. And what they found doesn't make sense, can't make sense. Every detail contradicts every other detail. Every explanation raises more questions than it answers. Some died of hypothermia near a tree they tried to climb. That makes sense. If you're freezing, you might climb a tree to see the way back to shelter. Tragic, but understandable. But others had injuries that couldn't come from falling or freezing. Crushed ribs without external wounds, fractured skulls. One woman was missing her tongue, her eyes, parts of her face, gone, not torn by animals, but removed. The Soviet medical examiner said the force required to cause some of the injuries was equivalent to a car crash, but there were no cars on that mountain, no falls that could generate that kind of impact. And that's not even the strangest part. Some of their clothes showed traces of radiation, not enough to kill immediately, but measurable, significant. Why? How? Where did it come from? The Soviet investigation concluded the hikers died from a compelling unknown force. That's not an explanation. That's an admission of failure. That's the official government position. Something killed these people, and we have no idea what it was. The file was classified, hidden away, not released until decades later. And when it finally came out, when researchers could examine the evidence, when they could see the photographs, the autopsy reports, the testimony of the search teams, it only got worse. Because the details don't just fail to explain what happened, they suggest something so strange that most people refuse to believe it. Other groups in the area that night reported seeing strange lights in the sky. Orange orbs. Bright flashes. Things that moved in ways that lights shouldn't move. Are these reliable reports? Maybe not. Maybe they're people trying to attach their own sightings to a famous mystery, but they're on record, filed with Soviet authorities, part of the official investigation. The tent was found first, partially collapsed, partially standing, covered in snow but visible, and cut open, long tears from the inside. The searchers thought maybe someone had been trapped, maybe an avalanche had buried them and they'd cut their way out. But there was no avalanche debris, no evidence of snow crushing the tent, just these cuts, these desperate, panicked cuts. Inside the tent, everything was still there. Cameras, journals, food, and most importantly, their winter gear, their boots, their heavy coats, everything you absolutely need to survive in those conditions, left behind, as if survival in the immediate moment was less important than escaping the tent, as if staying inside was certain death and the cold was merely probable death. The footprints told a story, 9 sets of tracks leading downhill, away from the tent, away from safety, into the forest below. And these weren't normal tracks, these were the footprints of people fleeing, some running, some limping, some barely standing, all heading in the same direction, toward a cedar tree about a mile away. Under that tree they found the first 2 bodies, young men, stripped down to their underwear, frozen. Their hands showed severe trauma, as if they'd been trying to climb the tree, climbing frantically, desperately. Breaking branches, tearing skin. Why? To see something, to escape something, to signal someone, and their skin. The reports mention a strange colouring, reddish-orange, not normal for hypothermia victims, not normal for anything. Another detail that doesn't fit. Another impossibility in a story made of impossibilities. 3 more bodies were found between the tree and the tent, as if they'd tried to make it back, as if whatever drove them away had passed, and they realized their only hope was to return. But they didn't make it. The cold claimed them. One had a fractured skull, one had severe bruising. The leader, Dyatlov himself, was found clutching a branch. All frozen, all dead, all raising more questions. But the last 4 are where the mystery becomes a horror story, found months later in a ravine, buried under meters of snow, and their injuries were impossible, are impossible. A woman with her chest crushed so severely her ribs were shattered, a man with the same injury, forces equivalent to a car accident, but no external wounds, no bruising on the skin. The damage was internal, massive, fatal, but the skin was intact. How? You can't crush someone's chest cavity without damaging the skin. You can't apply that kind of force without leaving marks. It's physically impossible. Unless the force came from inside somehow, unless something happened that we don't have a framework to understand. And the missing tongue, the missing eyes, the missing soft tissue from one victim's face, gone, not torn, not shredded by animals. The medical report is clear. This was different. This was wrong. Theories have proliferated for over 60 years. Avalanche, military testing, secret weapons, infrasound creating panic. Even more exotic explanations involving phenomena we don't have names for. Every theory explains some details and fails to explain others. Every explanation creates new questions. The Russian government reopened the case in 2019. New investigation, new experts, modern forensic techniques, and their conclusion, avalanche, a rare type of avalanche that could happen hours after the initial snowfall, creating sudden panic, driving the hikers from their tent. But that doesn't explain the radiation, doesn't explain the injuries, doesn't explain the missing tongue, doesn't explain why experienced mountaineers would abandon all safety protocols and run into certain death. So we're left where we started, with 9 dead hikers and no explanation that satisfies, with evidence that contradicts itself, with a mystery that refuses to be solved. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Not a story with answers, not a mystery with a solution, but a window into something we don't understand, can't understand, maybe aren't meant to understand. 9 people went into the mountains. And something on that mountain killed them in a way that makes no sense, that defies physics, that breaks the rules of how reality is supposed to work. The mountain is still there, still cold, still deadly, still keeping its secret. And the question that has haunted investigators, researchers, and mystery enthusiasts for over 60 years remains unanswered. What really happened on Dead Mountain? Let's find out, or at least let's try. January 23rd, 1959, Sverdlovsk, Soviet Union. Now called Yekaterinburg, but in 1959 it was a thriving industrial city in the Ural Mountains, home to the Ural Polytechnical Institute, a place where bright young minds studied engineering, physics, chemistry, where the future of the Soviet Union was being built by ambitious students. 10 of those students were preparing for an expedition, not a casual hike, a serious Category 3 winter trek through the northern Urals. Category 3 was the highest difficulty classification in Soviet mountaineering. It meant dangerous terrain, extreme weather, complete isolation. It meant you had to be good, really good, or you didn't come back. The leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, 5th-year student in radio engineering, experienced mountaineer. He'd led expeditions before, always successfully. He was methodical, careful, respected by his peers. The kind of person you'd want leading you into the wilderness. The kind of person who doesn't make fatal mistakes. His team was hand-picked. Not random volunteers, but proven hikers, people he'd traveled with before, people he trusted. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, 4th-year economics student, strong, athletic, always cheerful. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, 4th-year engineering student, one of 2 women on the trek, tough, capable, not interested in being protected or coddled. She'd earned her place through skill, not gender politics. Alexander Kolevatov, 24, physics student, quiet, intellectual, physically strong despite his studious nature. Rustem Slobodin, 23, engineering student, experienced, reliable, known for his endurance. Yuri Yudin, 21, economics student, would become the only survivor, but not by skill or luck, by illness, a random stomach ailment that would save his life. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, radio engineering student, the other woman. Blonde, athletic, engaged to one of the team members, her whole life ahead of her. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, construction engineering student, French surname, Russian heritage, strong, experienced, ready for the challenge. Georgy Krivonishenko, 23, civil engineering student, had worked on secret nuclear facilities. His presence would later fuel radiation theories. And Semyon Zolotaryov, 37, the oldest member by far, not a student but a World War II, a veteran, decorated soldier, experienced outdoorsman. His inclusion was unusual. He'd asked to join at the last minute. The others barely knew him, but his credentials were solid. And Dyatlov approved. 10 people, all experienced, all prepared, all excited about the challenge ahead. The plan was straightforward on paper, but brutal in execution. They would travel north from Sverdlovsk, first by train, then by truck, then on skis. Their destination was Otorten Mountain, about 200 kilometers north. They'd ski through wilderness, camp in extreme cold, push themselves to the limit. The entire trek would take about 2 weeks. If successful, they'd earn their Category 3 certification, a mark of achievement, proof of their skill and endurance, something to be proud of for the rest of their lives. They departed on January 23rd. The weather was already brutal. January in the Urals means temperatures well below zero, sometimes -20, sometimes -30 or worse. The wind makes it feel even colder. Frostbite can happen in minutes. Hypothermia is a constant threat, but they were prepared. Heavy winter gear, skis designed for deep snow, tents rated for extreme cold, Food, stoves, everything they needed. They'd calculated their supplies carefully. Dyatlov had done this before. He knew what was required. The first few days were by train and truck, traveling through Soviet industrial areas, then into increasingly remote regions. The landscape changed from cities to towns to villages to nothing, just wilderness, forest and mountains, the kind of empty that city people can't really comprehend. Miles and miles where no one lives, where help is impossible, where you're completely on your own. On January 27th, they reached Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement. A tiny village, the edge of civilization. Beyond this point, there was nothing. Just the Urals, just winter, just them. They stayed in Vizhai overnight, resting, finalizing preparations. The locals probably thought they were crazy. Going into the mountains in January. Heading toward Dead Mountain. The Mansi people, the indigenous group who lived in the region, had names for those mountains. Names that meant danger. Names that meant death. But the students were Soviet youth, modern, scientific. They didn't believe in superstition. They believed in preparation, skill, equipment. They believed in themselves. On January 28th, they set out on skis, 10 of them, into the wilderness. Their plan was to reach Otorten by February 12th, then return to Vizhai, where Dyatlov would send a telegram confirming their safe arrival. The first day was hard but manageable, deep snow, cold, but they were strong, moving well, covering ground. They made camp, set up tents, cooked dinner, normal expedition routine. On January 28th, Yuri Yudin began feeling ill. Stomach problems, not serious but debilitating enough that continuing would be dangerous. In extreme cold, any weakness can become fatal. If you can't eat, can't keep warm, can't maintain your strength, you become a liability to yourself and to the group. The decision was made. Yudin would turn back. He'd returned to Vizhai with a group of Mansi hunters they'd encountered. It was the smart choice, the safe choice, and it saved his life. He said goodbye to his friends on January 28th. The last photographs show them smiling, joking, no sense of doom, no premonition of disaster. Just 9 people continuing their adventure, while one turned back, disappointed. Yudin would later say he felt guilty. Survivor's guilt is common. If he'd been stronger, if he'd pushed through, maybe he could have helped. Maybe he could have changed something, but probably not. Probably he would have just been victim number 10. The remaining 9 continued north. Their route took them through taiga forest, then into more open terrain as they climbed higher. The conditions were harsh but not unusual for the Urals in winter. Cold, windy, but they were handling it. Their experience was showing. They kept detailed journals and took photographs throughout the journey. These would later become crucial evidence. The photos show them setting up camps, skiing, goofing around. There's one famous photo of them building a storage platform called a labaz, where they cached extra supplies they'd retrieve on the return journey. They're smiling in the photo, working together. A team. The journals mention the cold, the difficulty of the terrain, but nothing alarming, nothing that suggested fear or concern. They were tired, certainly. Winter camping is exhausting, but they were managing, they were on schedule. By February 1st, they'd reached the eastern slope of Kolatsiachol, Dead Mountain. They were close to their goal. One more push to Otorten, then they could start the return journey. They were almost there. The weather that day was deteriorating, wind picking up, snow beginning to fall, but they'd camped in worse. They found a spot on the slope, not ideal, more exposed than they'd probably have liked, but acceptable. They set up their tent, secured it against the wind. Prepared dinner. The last photograph from the expedition shows them cutting through the snow, to level the ground for their tent. It's late afternoon, maybe early evening. The light is fading. They look tired, but okay. Normal expedition exhaustion, nothing wrong. That night, something happened. Something that would kill all 9 of them. Something that would create a mystery that has never been solved. But before we get to that, understand who these people were. They weren't reckless, they weren't stupid, they weren't unprepared. They were the best of Soviet youth, educated, trained, experienced. They'd survived dozens of expeditions before this one, and they were about to encounter something that their training, their experience, their preparation couldn't protect them from, something that would drive them from their tent in panic, something that would scatter them across a mountainside, something that would kill them in ways that made no sense. The mountain was waiting, and whatever lived on that mountain, whatever force existed there, was about to make its presence known in the most horrific way possible. February the 1st, 1959, late afternoon on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, 9 hikers are setting up camp for what they think will be just another night in the wilderness. They've been on this expedition for 5 days since leaving Vijay. They're tired, cold, but they're managing. Everything is normal. Let's talk about that campsite, because where they chose to camp matters. It's been analyzed and debated for over 60 years. Every detail scrutinized, every decision questioned. They pitched their tent on the slope itself, not at the tree line below where there would be shelter from the wind, not in the forest where they'd have wood for fire and protection from the elements, but on the open slope, about 1,000 meters below the summit, exposed, windy, far from ideal. Why? The most likely explanation is practical. They'd traveled further that day than they'd planned. It was getting dark, and turning back to reach the forest would have meant losing altitude they'd worked hard to gain. In mountaineering, you sometimes camp in suboptimal locations because going further isn't feasible. It's not ideal, but it's not necessarily wrong either. They dug into the snow to level the ground, standard practice. You create a platform so your tent isn't on a slope. The photographs show them doing this work. Hard labor in the cold, but necessary. The tent itself was actually 2 tents sewn together to accommodate all 9 people. They'd modified it themselves. It was large, designed for exactly this kind of expedition. Soviet winter tents were robust, heavy, designed to withstand serious weather. Inside, they arranged their sleeping bags, stored their equipment, everything organized, everything in its place. They cooked dinner on a small stove. The journal entries from that day are routine. Weather notes, distance traveled, nothing unusual. The last entry in the journal was made by someone, probably Dyatlov, noting the conditions. Strong wind, visibility poor, decided to camp on the slope. Practical observations, no fear, no concern, just recording the facts. They ate, they talked. Maybe they made jokes, maybe they discussed the next day's plans. We don't know. We can only imagine those last normal hours, 9 people in a tent, warm in their sleeping bags, tired from the day's exertion, planning to wake up, continue their trek, achieve their goal. And then something happened. We don't know what time, probably late evening or early night, between 9 p.m. and midnight based on later analysis. The wind was howling outside, snow falling, temperature around -25 Celsius, maybe colder with the wind chill. Inside the tent, something occurred that caused immediate, overwhelming panic. Not gradual concern, not a slow realization of danger, but instant terror. The kind of fear that overrides all rational thought. The kind of fear that makes impossible things seem like the only option. They cut through the tent from the inside, multiple cuts, long tears in the fabric. The investigation found these cuts clearly made by knives, made by people desperate to get out fast, people who couldn't take the few seconds to unlace the tent flaps, people who needed to escape right now. Think about what that means. Really visualize it. You're in your sleeping bag. It's -25 outside. Suddenly something happens, something so terrifying that you grab a knife and start sawing through the tent wall. You don't put on boots, you don't grab your coat, you don't even think about the cold outside, you just need to get out. All 9 of them, all cutting, tearing, fleeing, together or in sequence, we don't know, but all of them made the same impossible choice. Better to face certain hypothermia than stay in that tent one more second. The tent didn't collapse on them. The investigation was clear about this. The tent was still standing when the search team found it weeks later. Partially collapsed, yes, but from snow accumulation, not from sudden catastrophic failure. The cuts were deliberate, made by people trying to escape. What could cause that? What could make 9 experienced hikers abandon all survival instincts? Let's consider the conventional explanations first. The ones that seem plausible until you examine them closely. Theory 1, avalanche. Maybe they heard or felt an avalanche beginning, panicked, cut their way out expecting to be buried, but there was no avalanche. The tent wasn't buried. The slope wasn't steep enough for the type of avalanche that would cause that kind of panic, and experienced mountaineers would know the difference between avalanche conditions and normal snowfall. Theory 2, someone or something attacking them, hostile intruders, animals, something that posed immediate physical danger. But there were no tracks around the tent except those of the hikers themselves, no sign of struggle inside the tent, no blood, no damage except the cuts they made themselves. Whatever drove them out wasn't inside the tent with them. Theory 3, carbon monoxide poisoning from their stove. This can cause confusion, hallucinations, panic. But carbon monoxide doesn't affect 9 people identically at the same moment. Some would have been affected more than others, some would have made rational choices. And the cuts in the tent were purposeful, coordinated, not the random actions of poisoned, confused people. Theory 4, infrasound. Low-frequency sound waves that can cause anxiety, panic, dread. The wind blowing across the mountain could theoretically create such sounds, but infrasound causes discomfort, not the kind of absolute terror that makes you flee into deadly cold. And if it was the wind, why did the panic stop once they left the tent? Each theory explains the flight from the tent, but fails to explain other evidence. Each theory creates as many questions as it answers. So let's follow what we know happened. Let's trace their path from the tent into the darkness. They fled downhill, all 9 of them, heading northeast toward the forest below, about 1,500 meters away, almost a mile, downhill in deep snow, in darkness, in a blizzard. The search team found their footprints weeks later, preserved under fresh snow. And these tracks told a story, 9 sets of prints, some in socks, some in a single boot, some barefoot. And think about that. Barefoot in snow at -25 degrees. The pain would be immediate, excruciating. Your feet would start to freeze within minutes, but they ran anyway. The tracks showed they stayed relatively together. Not scattered randomly, but moving as a group or in small groups, following each other, heading toward the tree line. Some tracks showed someone had fallen, gotten up, continued. Some showed people walking, some running, but all going the same direction, away from the tent, toward the forest. This suggests organization. Even in their panic, they stayed together. They had a destination in mind, the forest, safety in numbers, find shelter among the trees. The footprints continued for about half a mile before the wind and snow covered them, but the direction was clear. Toward a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest. The temperature was lethal. At -25 Celsius with wind, hypothermia begins almost immediately for someone inadequately dressed. You have minutes, not hours. Your body starts shutting down. Your extremities freeze first, fingers, toes. Then your core temperature drops. Your thinking becomes impaired. Your movements sluggish. Some of them were in their underwear, literally in their underwear, in that cold, by choice. Because staying in the tent seemed worse. The cedar tree became their rally point. It was large, distinctive, visible even in the darkness and snow, a landmark. They reached it and tried to take action. The first two bodies were found at the cedar tree months later. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Yudin, the two Yuris as they were called, found at the base of the tree, frozen solid. They'd tried to start a fire, evidence of charred branches, attempts to gather wood, but starting a fire in a blizzard with frozen hands is nearly impossible, especially without proper tools, without matches readily accessible. The burns on their hands suggested they'd tried desperately, burning themselves trying to create warmth. They'd also tried to climb the tree. The branches showed damage up to about 5 meters high, broken limbs, bark stripped away. Their hands showed evidence of this trauma. Climbing frantically, desperately. Why climb a tree in a blizzard? Several possibilities. To see the tent, to spot their location, to escape something on the ground, to break branches for fire. All of these are plausible. None of them are good options. All of them show desperation. The two Yuris were found in their underwear. Doroshenko was barefoot. Yudin had wool socks. Both frozen in positions that suggested they died relatively quickly once they stopped moving. Hypothermia doesn't take long in those conditions. But here's a crucial detail. They'd been partly undressed by others. Some of their clothing was missing, clothing that was later found on other bodies. This is actually a well-documented phenomenon in extreme cold survival situations. The living take clothing from the dead. It sounds cold, even cruel, but it's rational. The dead don't need clothes, the living do. This tells us something important. Some of the group survived longer than these first two. They were alive, conscious, and making rational survival decisions, taking clothes from those who died, trying to stay warm. 3 more bodies were found between the cedar tree and the tent. Found during the initial search in late February, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, and Igor Dyatlov himself. They were found at different points along the slope, spaced out, as if they'd been trying to return to the tent. As if whatever drove them away had passed, and they realized their only hope was to get back to shelter, to their equipment, to their warm clothes. Kolmogorova was found about 630 meters from the cedar tree. On her back, frost on her face, her hands clutching nothing. She'd almost made it halfway back. Almost. Slobodin was found 480 meters from the cedar tree. He had a fractured skull. Not severe enough to kill immediately, but enough to disorient him, weaken him. Did he fall, hit his head on something, or did something hit him? Dyatlov was found 300 meters from the cedar tree. The leader, the one who'd organized this expedition, the one who was supposed to bring everyone home safe. He was found face up, frozen, one hand clutching a small birch branch, as if he'd grabbed it for support, then never let go. All 3 had died of hypothermia. That was the official cause of death. They'd frozen slowly, painfully, trying to make it back to the tent. They'd made rational decisions. Going back was the right choice, but their bodies had failed them. The cold had won, but Slobodin's skull fracture was noted, documented, not severe but present, an anomaly, something that didn't quite fit. So by late February, 5 bodies had been found, 5 of 9. The search continued. Where were the other 4? The search team looked everywhere. They probed the snow, they searched the forest, they checked the ravines, but they found nothing. Winter in the Urals is brutal. Snow continues to fall. The landscape changes. What's visible one day is buried the next. Finding bodies in those conditions is nearly impossible. The official search was called off in late February. 5 bodies recovered, 4 still missing. The case was opened, investigated, and the findings were confusing. The 5 bodies showed death by hypothermia. Except for Slobodin's skull fracture, there were no major injuries, no signs of violence, no evidence of struggle. They'd fled the tent, tried to survive, failed, and died. Tragic, but understandable. But where were the other four? And more importantly, why had they fled the tent in the first place? The investigators examined the tent, the cuts from inside, the equipment left behind, the journals, the cameras. Everything was documented, photographed, recorded. And then something strange happened. The investigation was suddenly, without full explanation, closed. On May 28, 1959, the case was shut down. The official conclusion: the cause of death was hypothermia, caused by fleeing the tent to escape a compelling natural force. A compelling natural force? Not an avalanche, that would have been specified. Not an animal attack, that would have been mentioned. Not other humans, that would have been investigated. A compelling natural force. Vague, unsatisfying, the kind of conclusion that isn't really a conclusion at all. The files were classified, sealed, access restricted. For decades, this case was a closed book. A tragedy that the Soviet government didn't want discussed. Why? That's been debated for years. Was it embarrassment that they couldn't solve it? Was it evidence of military testing they wanted hidden? Was it something else entirely? We don't know. We may never know. But the story doesn't end with those 5 bodies, because in May, when the snow began to melt, when the search resumed, they found the other 4. And that's when this mystery became something else entirely. Something darker, something that can't be explained by cold weather and bad luck. Because the injuries on those 4 bodies were impossible. R&B. May 4th, 1959. 3 months after the incident, the snow on Kolatshakal was melting. Spring was coming to the Urals, slowly, reluctantly, but coming. The landscape that had been a uniform white hellscape was now revealing its secrets. The search team had never really stopped looking. Even after the official investigation closed, even after the first 5 bodies were found and buried, people kept searching. Family members, fellow students, local volunteers, because 4 people were still missing. 4 bodies still somewhere on that mountain. A Mansi hunter named Ivan Pashin was part of the search team. He knew these mountains better than the outsiders, knew the terrain, knew where water would flow in spring, where snow would drift deep, where someone might take shelter. On May 4th, he was searching a ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree, a steep-sided gully filled with snow throughout the winter, now with a stream beginning to flow through it. And he found something, clothing, pieces of fabric, visible in the snow. And then he saw them, 4 bodies, buried under 4 meters of snow and ice, hidden all winter, preserved by the cold. The 4 were Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles. They'd made it to this ravine. They'd survived longer than the others, possibly hours longer. They'd made rational decisions, taking clothing from the dead Yuris at the cedar tree. They'd sought shelter in this ravine, out of the wind. But something had happened to them. Something catastrophic. The bodies were recovered carefully, documented, transported back for autopsy. And that's when the case went from mysterious to impossible. Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny performed the autopsies. He was an experienced medical examiner. He'd seen bodies in every condition imaginable. Accident victims, murder victims, war casualties. He knew trauma. He knew what different types of injuries looked like, and what he found in these 4 bodies shocked him enough that his reports were detailed, emphatic, and deeply disturbing. Let's start with Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old, engineering student, tough, capable, experienced hiker. She had been wearing the most clothing of the group. She had pieces of Yuri Doroshenko's clothes taken from his body after he died. She'd been trying to survive. Her autopsy showed ribs 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 on the right side fractured, multiple ribs, catastrophic damage, massive chest trauma. Her heart had hemorrhaged from the force of impact. No external wounds, no bruises on the skin, no cuts, no abrasions. The skin was intact. Her tongue was missing, not torn, not damaged, gone. The hyoid bone and tissue around her mouth and face were also missing. Clean removal. Her eyes were missing. Both of them. Gone. Dr. Vozrojdeny stated that the force required to cause the rib fractures was comparable to a car crash or bomb shock wave, not a fall, not a human attack, something with enormous force, force that crushed her chest from within without damaging the skin. That's not how injuries work. When you apply force to a human body, the skin damages first. Bruises form, abrasions occur. The skin is the first point of contact. You cannot crush someone's ribs without leaving external marks. It's physically impossible. Unless the force came from inside somehow, unless the pressure was distributed so evenly across the surface that no single point bruised, unless something happened that we don't have a framework to understand. And the missing tongue, the missing eyes, the missing facial tissue, Dr. Vozrojdeny noted that this wasn't animal predation. He'd seen animal damage to bodies. This was different. The removal was too clean, too specific. Some researchers have argued that decomposition and water flow could explain this. Bodies in water lose soft tissue. Scavengers target eyes and tongues first. They're soft, accessible. But Dubinina's body had been frozen for 3 months, under meters of snow and ice. In May, there wasn't significant decomposition yet. And the specific pattern of tissue loss didn't match typical predation. Semyon Zolotaryov, 37 years old, the oldest member, World War II veteran, decorated soldier, experienced outdoorsman. He also had massive trauma. His autopsy showed ribs fractured on both sides, multiple ribs, catastrophic impact, open skull fracture at the base of the skull, massive internal bleeding, no external bruising, no skin damage corresponding to the internal injuries. He was wearing a camera around his neck. That camera was recovered. The film was developed. It showed nothing unusual, just pictures from the expedition. Normal hiking photos. The rib fractures were identical in nature to Dubinina's. Same type of force, same impossible lack of external damage. Dr. Vozrojdeny compared the trauma to what he'd seen in car accident victims thrown from vehicles at high speed. But there were no vehicles on that mountain, no way to generate that kind of force. Nikolai Thibault Brignol had a different injury pattern. Massive skull fracture, depressed fracture of the temporal bone, the kind of injury that would cause immediate unconsciousness and likely death within minutes to hours. No external wound, no skin damage, no abrasion where the skull was fractured. Again, the damage was internal, severe, fatal, but without corresponding external injury. This might have been from a fall, hit his head on a rock under the snow. That's plausible, except there's no external damage, and when you hit your head hard enough to fracture your skull, you get a wound, you get bruising, you get something visible, unless he was wearing something that distributed the force, a hat, but that wouldn't prevent all external damage from a force great enough to fracture bone. Alexander Kolevatov had the least severe injuries. He appeared to have died primarily from hypothermia, but he was found with the other 3 in the ravine, and his presence there raises questions about what he witnessed, what he experienced. 4 bodies, 3 with impossible injuries, 1 medical examiner struggling to explain what he's seeing. Dr. Vozrojdeny did his best. He documented everything meticulously. His reports are detailed, professional, thorough, and they make clear that he found these injuries highly unusual, not normal, not explainable by typical accident scenarios. The investigators tried to make sense of it. If not a fall, then what? What could crush 3 people's chests without leaving external marks? What could fracture a skull without breaking the skin? Some proposed a theory. Maybe they were in the ravine when a sudden collapse of snow fell on them from above. Heavy, wet snow. Enormous weight, pressure from all sides simultaneously. That could explain the lack of external bruising. The force would be distributed evenly. But the rib fractures weren't from compression. They were from impact. The fracture patterns showed sudden force, not gradual pressure. And if snow had fallen on them with enough force to break ribs, it would have left evidence. Displaced snow, disturbed terrain, something. Then there was the radiation. This is where the case gets even stranger. Some of the clothing recovered from the bodies showed elevated levels of radioactivity. Not extreme. Not immediately dangerous, but measurable, significantly above background levels. Specifically, Dubinina's clothing showed radiation, Kolevatov's clothing, Zolotaryov's. The fragments that had been taken from the 2 Yuris at the cedar tree also showed traces. The testing was done carefully. Multiple samples confirmed results. The radiation was real, but where did it come from? Theory. Krivonishenko had worked at a nuclear facility before the expedition. He'd been involved in the aftermath of the Kishtim disaster in 1957, a major nuclear accident in the Urals that the Soviet government covered up. Maybe his clothes were contaminated, and that contamination transferred to others when they shared clothing. Possible. But the radiation was found on specific items, not uniformly distributed. And Krivonishenko wasn't one of the 4 found in the ravine. His body, found at the cedar tree, wasn't tested for radiation, so we don't know if he was the source. Theory. Military testing. The Urals were home to nuclear facilities, secret military installations. Maybe the hikers encountered something they shouldn't have. Maybe they were exposed to radiation from weapons testing or nuclear material. Possible. But there's no evidence of military presence in that specific area at that specific time, and the radiation levels weren't high enough to cause immediate harm. They were notable, but not dangerous. Not the kind of levels you'd associate with weapons or accidents. Theory. Natural radiation. Some rocks and minerals are naturally radioactive. Maybe the hikers camped near a source of natural radiation. Possible. But why only certain clothes? Why not their tent? Why not all their gear? The radiation remains unexplained. Another detail that doesn't fit. Another piece of evidence that raises more questions than answers. The investigation struggled with all of this. The injuries, the radiation, the missing tongue and eyes, the strange orange coloring of the skin reported on some bodies. Every answer led to new questions. And then abruptly, the case was closed, again, for the 2nd time, officially concluded. The finding: death caused by a compelling natural force which the hikers were unable to overcome. That phrase again. Compelling natural force. Not specific, not explanatory. Just an admission that they didn't know, couldn't know, didn't want to know. The files were sealed, classified, locked away in Soviet archives. The families were told to stop asking questions. The case was over, but of course it wasn't over, because the evidence existed, because people remembered, because the questions wouldn't go away. For decades, this case was studied quietly by researchers who got access to fragments of evidence, by family members who kept asking questions, by journalists who sensed a story, by anyone fascinated by mysteries that can't be solved. And slowly, over decades, more information emerged. Witness statements from other groups in the area that night, reports of strange lights in the sky, testimony from the search teams about the condition of the bodies, the state of the tent, the strange details they noticed but didn't include in official reports. All of this fed into theories, dozens of theories, some plausible, some absurd. some somewhere in between. But before we dive into theories, there's one more crucial piece of evidence we need to examine, because it's not just about the bodies. It's not just about the injuries. It's about what the hikers themselves documented, what they saw, what they recorded, what they left behind as evidence of their last hours, the cameras and journals, the final photographs, the last written words. These tell us something about what happened on that mountain. Maybe not the whole story, maybe not even close, but they give us glimpses, fragments, pieces of a puzzle that refuses to come together. When the search team found the tent on February 26, 1959, they also found something invaluable: the hikers' cameras and journals. Multiple cameras, several journals, undeveloped film, written records of the entire expedition. These were experienced hikers. They documented everything. It was standard practice for Soviet expeditions. Keep detailed records, take photographs, prove you made the journey, record the conditions, evidence of achievement. But in this case, these documents became evidence of something else entirely. Evidence of what happened before that night. Evidence of whether they'd noticed anything strange. Evidence of their state of mind in those final hours. 5 cameras were recovered. 4 were found in the tent, protected from the elements. 1 was found on Zolotaryov's body in the ravine, around his neck, under his clothes. That camera had been with him when he died. The film was carefully developed, each frame studied, each image analyzed for clues, anomalies, anything that might explain what happened. Most of the photographs are exactly what you'd expect from a hiking expedition: setting up camp, skiing through snow, group photos, smiling faces, people being goofy, building the labaz, the storage platform for cached supplies, working together, looking cold but happy. The photos show competent people doing competent things, nothing reckless, nothing that suggests poor judgment or inadequate preparation. They're dressed appropriately. Their equipment looks solid. They're clearly experienced. There are photos from February the 1st itself, the day they died, multiple photos showing them cutting into the slope to level the ground for their tent. Hard work. They look tired, but that's normal. Expedition fatigue. The last clear photo taken that day shows them working on the tent site. It's late afternoon. The light is fading. Mountains in the background. Snow everywhere. They're focused on their work. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. Just another day on an expedition. But then there are the mysterious photographs, the ones that have generated endless speculation. On one of the cameras, sources differ on which one, there are several frames at the end of the roll that are extremely overexposed or completely dark. Just blank frames or frames with nothing recognizable in them. Some researchers believe these might have been taken that night, during whatever happened, in darkness, in panic. Someone grabbing a camera and clicking the shutter reflexively. But they might also just be accidental exposures. Cameras in 1959 didn't have the safety features modern cameras have. It was easy to accidentally expose a frame while loading or unloading film. Easy to click the shutter while handling the camera. The famous last photo has been analyzed endlessly. On one camera, there's a frame that appears to show lights in the sky, bright spots against darkness. Some people claiming these are orbs, UFOs, evidence of something anomalous. But the image is too degraded, too unclear to definitively show anything. It could be lights, it could be light leaks in the film, it could be processing artifacts, it could be camera settings causing strange effects. Modern analysis using digital enhancement has been attempted. Some researchers claim to see patterns in those lights. Others say there's nothing there. The image is a Rorschach test. You see what you're looking for. Zolotaryov's camera is particularly interesting. He was wearing it when he died. The film was developed. It showed normal expedition photos up to a point, then several frames of sky or unclear images at the end. Why was he wearing the camera? In that cold with limited clothing, a camera around your neck is extra weight, extra exposure to cold. Why keep it? Was he trying to document something, or did he just grab it instinctively when fleeing the tent? We don't know. The photos on his camera don't show anything definitively unusual, just unclear images that might be anything or nothing. The journals are more revealing. Multiple members kept diaries. Dyatlov kept an official expedition log. Others kept personal journals. These were recovered and studied carefully. Every entry examined for clues, for mentions of anything strange, for signs of fear or concern. And the journals are normal, almost aggressively normal. They talk about the weather, the terrain, who did what tasks, how far they traveled, how tired they were. Someone's stomach hurt, someone made a joke, they sang songs, they argued about routes. Normal expedition stuff, the kind of entries you'd expect from any hiking trip. The last entry in Dyatlov's log was made on February the 1st. It's practical, matter of fact, notes about the weather conditions, about deciding to camp on the slope, about visibility being poor. No mention of danger, no concern. There's no dramatic final entry, no "we're being followed," no "strange lights in the sky," no "something doesn't feel right." Just routine observations. Some researchers point to this as evidence that whatever happened came suddenly without warning. If they'd been experiencing fear or paranoia building over days, they'd have written about it. But they didn't. Everything was normal until it wasn't. Others argue that Soviet students in 1959 wouldn't write about concerns or fears in official journals. That would be seen as weak, as complaining, as not being properly Soviet. But personal journals wouldn't have that restriction, and those are also normal. There is one strange entry that's often cited. In Dubinina's journal, there's a passage that some translations render as cryptic or ominous, but this is disputed. Different translations give different meanings, and removed from context, any journal entry can sound strange. The reality is the journals don't tell us what happened that night. They tell us what happened before, and what happened before was a normal, if challenging, expedition. Then there's the evening Autorten newsletter. The hikers had created a humorous handwritten newspaper during the trek. It was found in the tent. It contained jokes, mock articles, silly content, a way to entertain themselves during the long evenings. Some entries in this newsletter have been interpreted as ominous, references to natives and spirits. But the context makes clear these were jokes. The hikers were poking fun at superstitions about the mountains, not expressing actual fear. Reading meaning into jokes written by people who'd soon be dead is easy, but those jokes weren't omens, they were just entertainment. So the cameras and journals give us a picture of the expedition before the incident. And that picture is remarkably unremarkable, everything normal, everything routine, no warning signs, which makes what happened next even more inexplicable. Because whatever caused 9 experienced hikers to flee their tent came suddenly without build-up, without warning signs they thought worth recording. But there's other evidence that emerged later. Witness testimony from other people who were in the general area that night. Several groups reported seeing strange lights in the sky on or around February the 1st, 1959. These reports were filed with Soviet authorities. They're part of the official record. A group of hikers about 50 kilometers south reported seeing orange spheres in the sky, moving slowly, visible for several minutes. This was reported before anyone knew about the Dyatlov incident. It wasn't a retrospective claim made to seem important. It was a contemporaneous observation filed as a matter of record. Another group, also to the south, reported similar lights, described as bright orange, moving in ways that didn't match normal aircraft or weather phenomena. Military personnel at a base in the region also reported unusual lights that night, filed official reports, documented the observations. Are these reports reliable? Maybe, maybe not. The human brain sees patterns, sees meaning. Unusual lights in the sky could be anything. Atmospheric phenomena, military flares, aircraft, satellites, meteors, aurora, ball lightning. But the reports exist, multiple independent observations, all from the same general area, all from the same night or within a day or two of the incident. Do they connect to what happened to the Dyatlov group? Impossible to say. Correlation isn't causation. Strange lights being visible doesn't mean those lights had anything to do with 9 deaths, but it's another data point. Another piece that doesn't quite fit but can't be ignored. Then there are the search team observations, things they noticed, but that didn't make it into official reports. Statements made years later in interviews. Some search team members mentioned that the tent, when found, smelled strange, not like decay. Not like a tent that had been closed up for weeks. Something else, chemical. Odd. But memory is unreliable. Decades later, people remember things that maybe didn't happen or attribute significance to details that weren't significant. One searcher mentioned that some of the trees in the area looked damaged, broken in ways that didn't match wind or snow, but this could be normal forest damage, or bears, or any number of natural causes. The point is that apart from the physical evidence, the bodies, the tent, the clothing, the injuries, we have a collection of observations that might mean something or might mean nothing. We have unexplained lights in the sky, we have strange observations from searchers, we have radiation on clothing, we have impossible injuries, we have a tent cut open from inside, and we have no explanation that accounts for all of it. Every theory explains some evidence and fails to explain other evidence. Every solution creates new problems, which brings us to the theories, decades of theories, some scientific, some speculative, some utterly absurd, but all attempting to answer the same question. What really happened on Dead Mountain on the night of February the 1st, 1959? For over 60 years, people have tried to solve this mystery. Researchers, scientists, investigators, journalists, conspiracy theorists. Everyone from serious academics to internet amateurs has proposed explanations for what happened on Kolatsiakul. Some theories are based on careful analysis of evidence. Some are based on speculation, some are based on wishful thinking or predetermined conclusions, and some are based on things that shouldn't exist but maybe do. Let's examine the major theories. The conventional ones first, then we'll move into stranger territory. Theory 1, avalanche. This is the official explanation as of 2019. The Russian government reopened the investigation that year, brought in modern forensic experts, analyzed the evidence with contemporary techniques, and concluded rare avalanche. The argument goes like this. A specific type of delayed avalanche could have occurred hours after snowfall, creating a sudden collapse of snow onto the tent. The hikers, hearing or feeling this, panicked. They cut through the tent to escape quickly, fearing they'd be buried. Once outside, they realized the avalanche wasn't as severe as feared, but by then they were already exposed to lethal cold. They tried to survive, failed, and died. The 2019 investigation used computer modeling to show that this type of avalanche, a slab avalanche, was theoretically possible on that slope under those conditions. The model showed that wind-transported snow could accumulate, create an unstable layer, and collapse hours later. The injuries? Caused by the weight of snow falling on the tent. The chest compressions on Dubinina and Zolotaryov could result from heavy snow crushing them while they were in their sleeping bags. The skull fractures from impact with rocks or ice chunks within the avalanche debris. This theory has support from serious scientists. It's been published in peer-reviewed journals. It's the official Russian government position, but it has massive problems. First, the tent was still standing, partially collapsed from accumulated snow, yes, but not destroyed by an avalanche. Avalanches that can cause fatal injuries are violent, destructive events. They don't leave tents partially standing. Second, experienced mountaineers recognize avalanche conditions. The slope wasn't steep enough for the type of catastrophic avalanche that would cause panic. If they'd experienced a minor snow collapse, they'd have known it wasn't life-threatening. Third, the injuries don't match avalanche trauma. The lack of external bruising, the specific patterns of rib fractures. Medical experts who've examined avalanche victims say these injuries are different. Fourth, if an avalanche was the cause of panic, why didn't they return to the tent immediately once they realized it wasn't severe? Why flee a mile away? Why try to start a fire and survive in the forest instead of returning to shelter? The avalanche theory explains the panic and the flight from the tent. Maybe. But it doesn't explain the injuries, the radiation, the missing tongue and eyes, the strange lights, or why experienced hikers would make such catastrophically bad decisions. Theory 2. Military testing. The Ural Mountains in 1959 were home to secret military installations, nuclear facilities, weapons testing sites. The Soviet government was deeply involved in Cold War military development, much of it classified. This theory suggests the hikers accidentally entered a restricted area or witnessed something they shouldn't have. Perhaps they were exposed to radiation from a weapons test or nuclear accident. They were caught in a military exercise or test. They witnessed something classified and were eliminated to prevent disclosure. They encountered a weapons malfunction, perhaps a rocket or missile that exploded or released toxic materials. This would explain the radiation on the clothing. It would explain why the case was classified. It would explain the government's reluctance to provide answers. Some versions of this theory suggest the hikers were deliberately killed, that military personnel tracked them down and eliminated them, but the evidence doesn't support murder. The injuries don't match violence from weapons. There were no bullet wounds, no stab wounds, no signs of a fight. Other versions suggest accidental exposure. Maybe a missile test went wrong. Maybe toxic gas was released. Maybe they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But if the military was involved, where's the evidence? There were no military vehicles in the area. The snow would have shown tracks. There were no reports of military activity that night. The radiation levels, while notable, weren't high enough to suggest weapons-grade material. And military involvement doesn't explain the specific injuries, doesn't explain why they fled the tent, doesn't explain the missing tongue and eyes. This theory has the advantage of explaining the government cover-up. If the military was responsible, even accidentally, the Soviet government would absolutely have classified everything and shut down investigation. But it doesn't explain the physical evidence, not completely, not satisfyingly. Theory 3. Infrasound. This is a fascinating scientific theory proposed by researchers studying acoustic phenomena. Here's how it works. Under specific weather conditions, wind blowing across mountain terrain can create low-frequency sound waves, infrasound. These frequencies are below the range of human hearing, but they can affect humans physiologically. Infrasound has been shown to cause feelings of dread and anxiety, panic, disorientation, paranoia, hallucinations, physical symptoms like nausea and chest pressure. The theory: that night, wind conditions on Kholat Syakhl created powerful infrasound waves. The hikers inside their tent were exposed to these frequencies. They began experiencing intense anxiety and fear without knowing why. The panic built until it became overwhelming, causing them to flee the tent in terror. Once away from the tent and the specific acoustic conditions, the infrasound stopped affecting them. But by then, they were already exposed to lethal cold. This theory is appealing because it's based on real science. It explains sudden, irrational panic. It explains why all 9 people would make the same terrible decision. It explains why the panic seemed to pass once they left the tent. Infrasound is documented to cause the psychological effects needed, but it has problems. Infrasound causes discomfort and anxiety, not the kind of absolute terror that makes you flee into deadly cold. If it was wind-generated infrasound, why did it affect them that specific night and not other nights? Infrasound doesn't explain the physical injuries, it doesn't explain the radiation, it doesn't explain the missing tongue and eyes. Infrasound might have been a factor, it might have contributed to panic, but as a complete explanation, it falls short. Theory 4. Paradoxical undressing and hypothermia. Some researchers argue that there's no mystery at all, that everything can be explained by known phenomena associated with hypothermia. Paradoxical undressing is a real thing. In severe hypothermia, as the brain shuts down, people sometimes remove their clothing. They feel hot when they're actually freezing. It's a well-documented phenomenon. Terminal burrowing is another real behavior. Hypothermia. Victims sometimes try to crawl into small spaces, under beds, into closets, into burrows. A primitive brain response, seeking shelter. The theory: something caused them to leave the tent, maybe a small avalanche, maybe wind damage, maybe a misunderstanding or mistake. Once exposed to the cold, they began dying of hypothermia. Some experienced paradoxical undressing, others made rational decisions to take clothing from the dead. The injuries could be from falls on the mountainside, from climbing trees, from stumbling in the dark. The missing tongue and eyes are decomposition and scavenger activity. The radiation is either contamination from Krivonishenko's previous work or natural sources. There's no mystery, just a series of unfortunate events compounded by cold and panic. This theory has the advantage of not requiring unknown forces or unlikely coincidences. Everything it proposes is known to happen, but it doesn't explain why they left the tent. The tent was intact, functioning, their best chance of survival. Experienced hikers don't leave shelter in those conditions without overwhelming reason, and the injuries still don't match falls or cold exposure. The force required for those rib fractures is enormous. The lack of external damage is inexplicable. Theory 5. Yeti or wildlife. Some theories propose animal attacks, bears, wolves, or in more exotic versions, an unknown creature, a yeti, a remaining population of prehistoric animals, something undiscovered. The Mansi people spoke of spirits in the mountains. Maybe those spirits were actual creatures. Maybe the hikers encountered something territorial, aggressive, frightening. This would explain sudden panic, explain fleeing the tent, explain some of the injuries. But there were no animal tracks around the tent, no evidence of an attack, no bites, no claw marks, no tissue damage consistent with predation. The missing tongue and eyes could theoretically be scavenging, but the pattern doesn't match typical animal behavior, and animals don't cause internal injuries without external damage. Now, this theory is popular in sensational retellings but has essentially zero support from the physical evidence. Theory 6. Human conflict. Maybe the hikers encountered other people. Maybe there was a conflict. Maybe they were fleeing from hostile humans, escaped prisoners, hostile Mansi, military personnel, criminals. This would explain panic and flight, explain why all 9 left together, explain why they didn't return. But there were no other tracks in the snow, no evidence of other people, no signs of struggle. The injuries don't match human violence, no defensive wounds, no weapon marks, no beating patterns. And who would be wandering those mountains in February, in those conditions? It's possible, but unlikely. Theory 7. Toxic exposure. Perhaps the hikers were exposed to toxic gas, chemicals, or biological agents. Natural gas pockets can exist in mountains, chemical exposure from military testing, something that caused hallucinations, panic, or physical symptoms. Carbon monoxide from their stove has been suggested, but CO poisoning doesn't cause uniform panic. Some people would be more affected than others. Natural gas is possible, but would need a source, and gas exposure doesn't explain the physical trauma. Toxic exposure might explain panic and strange behavior, might explain government cover-up if military chemicals were involved, but doesn't explain the injuries. Theory 8. Ball lightning or electrical phenomena. Ball lightning is a rare, poorly understood phenomenon. Spherical electrical discharges that can appear during storms, float through the air, and sometimes enter enclosed spaces. Witnesses have reported ball lightning causing fear, causing electrical sensations, even causing injuries. It's real, but rare and unpredictable. Theory: ball lightning or similar electrical phenomenon entered or approached the tent. The hikers, terrified by this glowing, moving object, fled. The electrical discharge somehow caused the injuries. This would explain the strange lights reported in the sky, explain sudden panic. It perhaps even explains some unusual aspects of the injuries if electrical discharge can cause internal trauma. But electrical injuries don't look like crush injuries, they look like burns. And ball lightning doesn't explain the radiation, the missing tissue, or the specific pattern of events. Theory 9. Katabatic winds. These are powerful downslope winds that can occur suddenly on mountains. They can be incredibly forceful, creating noise, shaking tents, making survival difficult. Maybe a sudden katabatic wind hit the tent, damaged it, and the hikers fled, thinking the tent was being destroyed. Once outside, they couldn't return against the wind. This explains flight from the tent, explains panic, explains rational people making seemingly irrational choices, but it doesn't explain the injuries, the radiation, the missing tissue, or why they'd run so far from the tent rather than sheltering nearby. Theory 10. Combination-complex event. Many modern researchers propose that multiple factors contributed, not one single cause, but a cascade of events. Infrasound or unusual weather creating anxiety, a minor snow collapse damaging the tent, panic causing flight, hypothermia affecting judgment, falls and accidents causing injuries, natural decomposition and scavenging causing tissue loss, contaminated clothing explaining radiation. This is probably the most realistic approach. Real disasters are often complex, with multiple contributing factors. The specific combination of circumstances on that particular night created a perfect storm of bad events. This theory has the advantage of incorporating multiple evidence points. It doesn't require unknown forces. It accepts that some details might never be fully explained, but it feels unsatisfying. It's a non-answer. Multiple things happened isn't really an explanation. It's an admission that we don't have a coherent single explanation. Theory 11. The Unexplained. And then there are theories that venture into truly speculative territory. UFOs, secret government experiments, paranormal phenomena, interdimensional beings, time anomalies, wormholes, energy weapons, psychic phenomena. These theories exist primarily because all conventional explanations have problems. When rational explanations fail, people turn to irrational ones. Are any of these possible? In the sense that we can't prove they're impossible, sure, but there's no evidence supporting them. They require believing in things we have no proof exist. The strange lights could be UFOs. Or they could be atmospheric phenomena, military flares, weather balloons, meteors, or misidentifications of ordinary objects. The injuries could be from unknown weapons, or they could be from known causes that left unusual patterns. The radiation could be from secret experiments, or from contaminated clothing and natural sources. These theories are popular in documentary films and conspiracy websites. They make for interesting stories, but they're not supported by evidence. They're supported by the absence of better explanations, which isn't the same thing. What really happened? Here's the honest answer. We don't know. We may never know. The most likely explanation based on current evidence is probably some combination of natural phenomena, weather, wind, possibly minor snow collapse, panic response, possibly amplified by infrasound or other environmental factors. a cascade of bad decisions made in extreme conditions, injuries from falls, accidents, and environmental factors, natural decomposition and scavenging. Some details we'll never fully understand because the evidence has been lost or was never clear. But this explanation doesn't satisfy. It doesn't account for all the evidence, leaves questions unanswered. The radiation remains unexplained. The specific pattern of injuries remains unusual. The sudden panic remains mysterious. The missing tongue and eyes remain disturbing. Maybe we're looking for too much coherence. Maybe reality is messier than we want it to be. Maybe there isn't a single dramatic explanation, but rather a confluence of unfortunate circumstances that created something that looks like a mystery, but is really just chaos. Or maybe something happened on that mountain that we don't have a framework to understand, something rare, something unique, something that doesn't fit into our categories of normal disaster or known phenomena. The truth is, probably somewhere between the mundane and the impossible, more complex than they got lost and froze, but less exotic than they encountered aliens. But what makes this case endure is that every explanation, no matter how carefully constructed, leaves something unexplained. Every theory has holes. Every solution creates new questions. The Dyatlov Pass incident isn't just a mystery. It's a perfect mystery, one that resists solution, one that seems designed to frustrate every attempt at explanation. 9 experienced hikers went into the mountains in February 1959. Something on that mountain caused them to flee their tent in panic. They died in the cold, some with injuries that don't make sense, under circumstances that can't be fully explained. The files have been released. The autopsies have been analyzed. The evidence has been examined by dozens of experts. Modern science has been applied. Computer models have been created, and still we don't have answers. Maybe that's okay. Maybe not every mystery has a solution. Maybe some events are too complex, too chaotic, too dependent on lost details to ever be fully understood. Or maybe someday someone will find the missing piece, the detail that makes everything click into place, the explanation that accounts for all the evidence without creating new problems. Until then, Kolatsyachal keeps its secrets. Dead Mountain remains dead. And 9 young people who should have had full lives ahead of them remain frozen in time, victims of something we still can't name. The question that has haunted investigators for over 60 years remains: what really happened on Dead Mountain? We've examined the evidence. We've explored the theories. We've looked at the facts from every angle. And we're left where we started, with a mystery that refuses to be solved, with impossible injuries and inexplicable decisions, with radiation and missing tissue and strange lights, with 9 deaths that make no sense. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Dyatlov Pass incident isn't that we don't know what happened. It's that we might never know, that this mystery might be fundamentally unsolvable, that reality sometimes does things that don't fit our understanding, and there's nothing we can do about it. 9 people climbed a mountain in 1959. They never came back, and the mountain isn't telling. That's the story. That's the mystery. That's what happened and what didn't happen. On the night of February the 1st, 1959, on a mountain the Mountsie people wisely called Dead Mountain. Some places have names for a reason. Some warnings should be heeded. Some mysteries are mysteries because that's what they're meant to be. The Dyatlov Pass incident, 65 years later, and we're no closer to the truth than we were when those 9 frozen bodies were first discovered. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the lesson isn't about what killed them. Maybe the lesson is about the limits of human knowledge, about the things we can't explain, can't control, can't understand. The mountain is still there, still cold, still deadly, still keeping its secret. and 9 young people remain forever frozen in time, their deaths unexplained, their mystery unsolved, their story a warning that sometimes, even with all the evidence in the world, we still can't find the truth. What really happened on Dead Mountain? We don't know. We may never know. And perhaps that's the most terrifying answer of all.